Okay, good evening and welcome to our Lesson 5, Part 2 of our Truth Project. And the introduction states that explores how creation points beyond itself to a creator and how science, when practiced honestly, can reveal order, design, and meaning in the natural world. At the same time, it warns that science can be misused when people turn it into a worldview that excludes God and treats material explanations as the only valid ones. So, the lesson tonight is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 minutes. So, enjoy. Thank you.
Well, everywhere we look, we see this incredible complexity, this order, this harmony, that if you recall, Kepler was saying that is what science is all about. Science is involved in looking at this order and the harmony that God has created for us. But when we reject the designer, then you're left with this deep problem associated with the disconnect between a random chaotic box and all the order that we see and the beauty and the grandeur that's associated with it. Well, we're going to look at a few of these. What do you suppose this is? Joshua, you know what this is. What is it?
It is a blood clot.
It is a blood clot. What are the red things there?
Red blood cells.
Red blood cells, that's exactly right. What are the white things, the white strands?
Oh, is this fibrin?
Yes, that's exactly right. There's strands of fibrin. I'm impressed. Blood clotting is an incredible thing. Have you ever thought about it? What an amazing thing God has given to us in this little system that we just ignore called the clotting of the blood. What do you think about this? I mean, what would happen? We get cut, and we have to ask ourselves the question, why don't we bleed to death? Actually, I've got a friend who can explain this a whole lot better than I do, and so I'm going to have her explain this for you.
I cut my finger this morning, and it's bleeding. But if I put this Band-Aid on, it'll stop in a while. Did you ever wonder how it happens? I mean, does blood just stop because that's what it's supposed to do? Why doesn't our blood clot before we get it cut? I guess we just die then, because all our blood would harden up and stop flowing. Did you ever wonder why? Blood clotting is a very complex process involving thousands and millions of triggers that have to act just perfectly with one another to create the final outcome. Let me see if I can tell you how this works. First, you get a little cut like mine. Imagine you're in my bloodstream. There's a bunch of traffic going on, and pretend you're floating around with a cajillion other red blood cells, all with oxygen backpacks. Everything slows down when you get near the cut. This is called vascular constriction. In short, your body limits the flow near the cut because it knows something is wrong. And of course, you feel pain. So, a protein in your body called fibrinogen arrives on scene. Fibrinogen is primarily responsible for stimulating platelet clumping. Thrombin essentially cuts off the ends of the fibrinogen. Platelets clump by binding to collagen. A Upon activation, platelets release adenosine 5-diphosphate, ADP, and TXA2, which activate additional platelets, serotonin, phospholipids, lipoproteins, and other important proteins for the coagulation cascade. Activated platelets change their shape to accommodate the formation of the plug. Oh, sorry, I digress. Anywho, this complex thing called the Stewart factor converts prothrombin to thrombin, thereby converting fibrinogen to fibrin. By the way, the Stewart factor wasn't active until it was activated by the Christmas factor. Okay, there's a lot more to this process, like this goes there, and binding, recepting, who knows what. It's very complicated. But the net result is a clot. Stops the bleeding, cut heals, clot dissolves, you're on your way. Isn't that neat?
Isn't this an amazing system? Now, how long do you suppose that we took in our evolutionary process before we finally got the clotting system right? How long do you suppose we could last without a clotting system? Not very long. And especially the many generations it would take for us somehow to figure out all those factors. Do you know what happens when one of those doesn't work? Hemophilia is a result of one of those factors not working. What an incredible thing that God has given to us in blood clotting, which we probably just ignore because we expect it to happen. Okay, let's examine this reality then. Let's begin to look at Carl Sagan's statement. And we'll take his statement as the outline from which we're going to examine this theory. Sagan said that evolution is a fact amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. Well, if that's the case, if the fossil record and contemporary molecular biology are two things that demonstrate and support the fact of evolution, then let's simply take a look at those and see what reality says. We'll begin with molecular biology, and then we'll talk about the fossil record. What we're going to do is, first of all, begin with Charles Darwin's own statements about his theory. What it is that he laid out as the criteria by which one could reject his theory. Let's look at this first one. Darwin stated, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Do you understand the criteria he's laying out there? Because if gradual Darwinianism, his theory that said over a long period of time, organisms have these very slight changes, these very slight modifications, and that is what has led to the deep complexity that we see today. So what he is saying, he said, if you can demonstrate that there is a complex organ that could not have come into being by that slow, gradual process, then he said, my theory would absolutely break down. So let's take a look at that. We're going to ask Dr. Meyer again to examine part of the reality that exists when we take a look at Darwin's time and his theory, what he was saying in terms of what we're seeing today.
In the 19th century, biologists thought that cells were simple, homogeneous globules of plasm. Now, with that kind of understanding of life, it was easy to imagine how life might have arisen through a few simple chemical reactions, and the origin of life was no big problem. Post-1953, with the discovery of the structure of DNA and also the information-bearing properties of DNA, we can no longer look at the cell the same way. And what we're now discovering is that the cell is chock full of exquisite miniature machines, little turbines, little rotary engines, little walking robots that cart materials from one end of the cell to another. Now, in our experience, all of those kinds of entities are produced by one cause and only one cause, and that is intelligence. And that, again, challenges materialism, because the materialistic worldview of the 19th century said there's two fundamental realities, matter and energy. What we're now discovering is that there's a third fundamental reality, and that is information. And everything we know about information is that it must come from an intelligent cause. So the presence of information in living systems suggests an intelligence that preexists us that is responsible for all that exquisite nanotechnology and information.
Okay, so what Dr. Meyer is talking about here is this idea that what has happened in terms of the technology that we have now is that we have begun to take a look at that inner cell. Remember Paley's argument. If, he said, you were to find a machine, a complex machine, such as a pocket watch, you would understand instantly, you would know, it's plain to you, that what you have in your hand is not something that has just gradually come about as a result of some natural force. It's very clear to you. This has some sort of a design and it carries a purpose. Now, as Dr. Meyer was saying, in Darwin's time, the cell appeared to be a hidden little black box. It wasn't a machine, it was just some little living glob, and somehow it had the potential within it to be able to mutate and to change. But what we have today is the technology to actually look inside that cell. And what we find is incredible. We're going to return to unlocking the mysteries of life and look at what that inner cell looks like and the machinery and the incredible magnificence of what is going on inside that cell. Now, what I want you also to notice is that at the end of this, there will be a man by the name of Dr. Dean Kenyon, and he will be making a statement as the result of seeing this complexity. In order for you to understand the importance of this man's statement, you need to understand that for years and years, Dr. Kenyon was one of the leading scientists and proponents of his theory in trying to describe how the molecular structures and everything comes together. He was a proponent of a theory called chemical evolution. And you might be interested to see his statement about the grandeur of what is now to be seen within the living cell.
In the years since Kenyon's rejection of chemical evolution, science has revealed the details of an entire system of information processing that bears the hallmarks of intelligent design. With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the Earth.
What an amazing thing going on inside every living cell. The gentleman at the end, Dr. Kenyon, beholding the reality of what was going on within the cell, recognizing that his own theory, faced with the reality of the deep complexity, he used to believe for years and years that there had to be some random process there because there couldn't be a creator. And so his theory that some chemical attraction would bring all those things together. The more he began to look at the cell and the complexity, he realized that was impossible. And now that we understand what is really going on inside there, Dr. Kenyon recognizes and understands that this is the result of intelligent designer. That's the way we should respond. When we gaze into the box, when we gaze and see the plain evidence that God has given to us. You know, the problem is that doesn't always happen. Man doesn't always accede to the reality of what is plain to them. Dr. Francis Crick, a brilliant man, the co-discoverer of DNA, when he began to gaze into the cell and began to understand the deep complexities of what we have there. In fact, if you really want to understand how complex this issue is, it has been stated that just for the single amoeba, the information that is found within the amoeba to provide all of the DNA structure would fill 1,000 sets of Encyclopedia Britannicas. Amazing complexity. So when Dr. Francis Crick is peering into the microscope, and it is beginning to dawn on him the deep complexity of what we see here at the fundamental level of life, he becomes convinced that this could not have happened by chance. He says, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. So what does Dr. Crick do? Does he then turn to the reality of a creator? No. He then proposes a theory, a little modification of earlier theory, but his theory is directed panspermia. The theory that the first living cell must have been transported to the Earth from some other planet outside our solar system. This is a brilliant man. Why does he turn to a theory like this? By the way, what's the problem with this theory?
Well, who created the other planet?
Where did it come from? What has he done here?
Just shifted the problem back.
He's just put the problem off somewhere else. Now, he recognizes that, But what is he trying to gain? What does he do by saying, well, it could not have started here because it was just so complex, so it must have come from another planet? What is he trying to gain here?
Time.
Time. That's exactly right. Because he says it's impossible for this to have occurred within the billions of years here, so it must have occurred in a longer period of time somewhere else. But in the end, you can't go back far enough. You can't get enough time to come up with the complexity that we're seeing. George Wald, writing in The Origin of Life, says most modern biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis. Now, let's stop for a second. What is the spontaneous generation hypothesis?
Creation theory.
It's a hypothesis that life springs from non-life. Now, we used to think that that was true. If you recall, we used to think, as we saw maggots grow up out of meat, that somehow life sprung from nowhere. But of course, all of our studies began to show that no, that's not true. If you put something over the top of the lid of meat, as Pasteur did, we realize that those come from fly eggs. All of that you should know. So what he's saying is this spontaneous generation theory, we understand, has been broken down. But what does he say about it? Most modern biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis, yet unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, are left with nothing. I think a scientist has no choice but to approach the origin of life through a hypothesis of spontaneous generation. What is he saying? Well, it's just what we've been saying all along. If the evidence points outside the box, we won't go there. Although we say we will pursue the truth no matter where it leads, unless it leads to a special creation, unless it leads to a creator. And that's what Wald is saying. The scientific evidence points us there, but we will not go there. Wald then says this: one has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are. As a result, I believe in spontaneous generation. And why does he believe in spontaneous generation? Because he does not want to gaze upon the face of God. Rejecting the truth. They have exchanged the truth of God for a lie. So Darwin, recall, giving us the criteria for which we could say that his theory is broken down. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And this is exactly what has occurred. Dr. Michael Behe, in the publication of his book, Darwin's Black Box, fired a shot across the bow of the issue of evolution. And this is how he did it. Dr. Michael Behe one day was studying the complexity of the cell and turned to someone in the lab with him, and he simply asked the question, looking at all of these pieces of the cell which we have just seen, asking the question, how could this cell exist? Could this cell exist if this piece were not there? And of course the answer was no. Well, what if this piece were not there? No. In essence, what Dr. Behe came to was the concept that he calls irreducible complexity. And he uses a mousetrap as an example of irreducible complexity. It goes something like this. He says, if you take a mousetrap, a very simple device, it only has a few parts in it. The wooden base, spring, the dinner plate, little neck breaker, and the little piece that holds the neck breaker back, until an appropriate moment. Behe says, how well would the mousetrap work if one of the pieces were not there? Let's suppose that the spring were not there. The mouse would love it, but it wouldn't really work. What if, and in this mousetrap, there's just a little staple holding down one end of the rod between the spring? What would happen to the mousetrap? Well, I happen to have one of those for my house. The little staple came out. That's all that happened. Everything else is there. All the pieces are there, but the little staple that holds it in is not there anymore. How well does the mousetrap function? It does not. So Behe's argument is this. What we have discovered, the more we've opened up Darwin's black box, the cell being the black box, what we have discovered in there is the most intricate machinery. And he says, it is a machinery which is irreducibly complex. And what do we conclude? Using Darwin's own criteria? To Darwin, he said, the cell was a black box. Its inner workings were utterly mysterious to him. Now the black box has been opened up and we know how it works. Applying Darwin's test to the ultra-complex world of molecular machinery and cellular systems that have been discovered over the past 40 years, we can say that Darwin's theory has absolutely broken down. Now, how do we contrast that with these statements that evolutionary theory is a fact? All of a sudden now, using Darwin's own criteria to say this thing is broken down. Absolutely broken down. Let's take a look. Let's go back inside, down to the level in which we can actually begin to see the machinery and how that machinery works. That little piece that was constructed that we saw in the inner cell, that little piece taken by the machinery, now taken to a place and assembled in a larger piece of machinery, creates some of the most incredible workings within the living organism, and we're going to take a look at one called the bacteria flagellum.
Scott Minnick has studied the flagellar motor for nearly 20 years. His research has led him to challenge the co-option argument.
With a bacterial flagellum, you're talking about a machine that's got 40 structural parts. Yes, we find 10 of them are involved in another molecular machine, but the other 30 are unique. So where are you going to borrow them from? Eventually, you're going to have to account for the function of every single part as originally having some other purpose. So you can only follow that argument so far until you run into the problem of you're borrowing parts from nothing. But even if you concede that you have all the parts necessary to build one of these machines, that's only part of the problem. Maybe even more complex, I think more complex, is the assembly instructions. That is never addressed by opponents of the irreducible complexity argument.
Studies of the bacterial motor have indeed revealed an even deeper level of complexity. For its construction not only requires specific parts, but also a precise sequence of assembly.
You've got to make things at the right time. You've got to make the right number of components. You've got to assemble them in a sequential manner. You've got to be able to tell if you've assembled it properly so that you don't waste energy building a structure that's not going to be functional.
Building a molecular machine has been compared to the construction of a house, where workers follow a detailed blueprint and plan for assembly. The foundation of a house is poured before the walls are erected. Plumbing and electrical fixtures are installed prior to enclosing the walls of the structure. Windows must be hung before siding is applied, and shingles are attached only after plywood sheets are nailed to the rafters. So it is with the construction of a flagellar motor.
You build this structure from the inside out. You are counting the number of components in a ring structure or the stator. And once that's assembled, there's feedback that says, okay, no more of that component now. A rod is added. A ring is added. Another rod is added. The U-joint's added. Once the U-joint's at a certain size and a certain degree of bend, about a quarter turn, that's shut off, and then you start adding components for the propeller. These are all made in a precise sequence, just like you would build a building.
To build a motor correctly requires a complex system of machines that coordinate the timing of the assembly instructions. But how could natural selection construct such a system?
The co-option argument doesn't explain this. You see, in order to construct that flagellar mechanism, or tens of thousands of other such mechanisms in the cell, you require other machines to regulate the assembly of these structures. And those machines themselves require machines for their assembly.
If even one of these pieces is missing or put in the wrong place, your motor isn't going to work. So this apparatus to assemble the flagellar motor is itself irreducibly complex. In fact, what we have here is irreducible complexity all the way down.
We know a lot about the bacterial flagellum. We still have a lot to learn, but we know a lot about it. And there's no explanation for how this complex molecular machine was ever produced by a Darwinian mechanism.
Darwin's theory is absolutely breaking down. The more we examine, the more we look, the deeper we peer into this complexity called life, the mystery of life, which used to be a black box, the more it opens up and shows to us that there is this fantastic, complex factory filled with machines, all working together, almost as if somebody planned it, almost as somebody built it, almost as somebody designed it. The evidence is coming in over and over again, and it is overwhelming. And the evidence is increasingly pointing to the reality of the Creator. Well, how are people responding to that? Dr. W. The speculations of the origin of species turned out to be wrong. It is ironic that the scientific facts throw Darwin out, but leave William Paley, a figure of fun to the scientific world for more than a century, still in the tournament with a chance of being the ultimate winner. Amazing, is it not? The heavens declare the glory of God. It pours forth speech day after day. It is there. Well, let's examine another piece of this statement by Carl Sagan. Remember, he said evolution is a fact that is amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. We just looked at biology. Let's take a look now at the fossil record. We will begin again with Darwin's own criteria for which we might reject his theory. He said the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the earth must be truly enormous. And they should be, correct? If you have this long period of time, this very gradual changing species into other species, then what he's saying, that evidence should be everywhere. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? In other words, he says, why doesn't the fossil record show it? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graded organic change. So he's admitting that, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, I don't know how many times you have been told that the fossil record proves evolution. But what we have from Darwin is from the get-go, he says we've got a problem in the fossil record. So, we're going to ask Dr. Berlinski to give us a picture as to the problem associated with this idea of a long, gradual process and the number of changes which must have occurred in order for us to achieve the complexity that Darwin's theory says it should achieve?
The question has to be raised, as it should be raised whenever an evolutionary sequence is mentioned. What are exactly the predicted properties one would expect to find as one passes from a land-dwelling creature to a sea-dwelling creature? Specifically, how many changes are required to go from a creature such as Ambulocetus natans, which seemed to have been a land-dwelling creature, to a creature that spends the entire portion of its life in the ocean? Curiously enough, this is not a question that evolutionary biologists ask a whole lot. I did some back of the envelope calculations myself, and the most modest estimate I could come up with is that an organism requires roughly 50,000 morphological changes to adapt itself to the open-going ocean. And as soon as we introduce a quantitative estimate, however loose, however flabby, however spontaneous, then a great deal of puzzlement starts to intrude into the otherwise sunny picture. 50,000 changes, and we've got 2 members of a sequence. Where are the other 49,999 members of that sequence if Darwinian changes are incremental and they're small? After all, we're not talking about changes that are arbitrary. A creature must have these changes if it's to survive in the open ocean. And any attempt to put a quantitative number should induce a profound sense of perplexity, because the number of changes are so much greater than anything we see in the transitional record. Now, what is the proper explanation for this? Please understand, I don't have it. But neither do the other guys. Neither do the other guys, and in my opinion, they refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the question. That is a fundamental question in paleontology. How many changes are required? Can those changes be compared to the fossil record? And if they are compared to the fossil record, why do we see such deficiencies in the record as compared to the necessary changes? Very important issues.
Okay, so you understand the argument he's making here. If it only requires one change to go from a cat to a dog, then it would be easy for us to miss it in the fossil record. But if a change from one species to another requires 50,000 changes, there ought to be some evidence of that somewhere. Well, Darwin, recognizing the problem in the fossil record in his day, answers the problem this way. He says the geological record is extremely imperfect. In other words, he says we just haven't dug up enough fossils. And this fact will, to a large extent, explain why we do not find intermediate varieties, connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps. He who rejects these views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. Well, this leads us to an interesting situation then. If Darwin says you can reject my theory if the geological record doesn't show it, then let's examine the geological record. Patterson, who is an evolutionist himself, says, I will lay it on the line, there is not one such transitional fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. In other words, what he's saying is, look, when you look at the fossil record, you don't have that watertight argument there. You can't say that the fossil record shows this gradual change from one species to the other. I'm sure you've heard of the Archaeopteryx. When I first heard of it, it was conclusive evidence. It was the missing link. Is it? Or is it simply a fully formed species of its own? In other words, it's what Dr. Berlinski was saying. If you require 50,000 changes to get from here to here, and you have something that looks like it fits in there, and maybe you have 2, the question is that really supporting this theory, or are these 2 just simply unique species? An interesting question. David Raup now says, the director of the Field Museum of Natural History says, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. So Darwin said, you can rightly reject my theory if the geological record doesn't show it. The reason that it doesn't show it now is that we just don't have enough fossils. Well, now we're 120 years later, and we got a whole lot more fossils, and guess what? We're even worse off now than we were then. Now, Stephen Jay Gould recognized that those transitional forms are just not there. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and the nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. However reasonable, it is not the evidence of the fossils. So Dr. Gould responds not with, there must be a creator, but he responds with his own theory. You may be familiar with it. It is called punctuated equilibrium. This is what it looks like. The gradual theory of Darwinism looks like this. This is time, and it explains over time the slow, gradual change in living organisms from the simple to the complex. Gould then says a species will go along in time in a stasis mode. It doesn't change. And then all of a sudden, there is a great immediate change in that species, changing to another species. That then sustains a period of stasis until, boom, there is another immediate change. So we have the situation where Dr. Gould, recognizing that the fossil record does not support the theory, has now come up with another theory that is interesting because his theory is supported by the lack of evidence. Do you know what I'm saying? In other words, what he says is, my theory is supported by the lack of evidence in the fossil record. That's a strange place to be. So the fossil record does not support what Darwin proposed to be the truth claim about reality. Dr. Jonathan Wells, in his book Icons of Evolution, has gone through what he calls the icons that evolution has used over the years to explain why evolutionary theory is true. And yet when you look at these icons, we begin to find that they are hollow. They do not have the evidence to support them. So each one of these, whether we're talking about the fabled picture of man arising from apes, or Haeckel's diagrams I told you were faked, or the homology argument that says, well, evolution's true because of the similarity, or the four-winged fruit fly that we've bombarded with radiation, or the peppered moths, you recall, we now find have been tacked to the trees, to the tree of life that, as we just have seen, there is no evidence except for the end nodes. And finally, the picture that we've all seen, the convincing argument that, of course, we have descended from apes. What is the evidence? Well, what I'd like to do is to take a look at one of those icons. And that icon is the finch's beak, Darwin's finches. If you've been through a science class in America, you no doubt have heard the argument that Darwin's finches are the evidence that evolution is true. He wrote about it a lot. It's been captured in an incredible video called Icons of Evolution. And we're going to take a look at a clip on one of those icons referring to Darwin's finches.
A second icon of evolution, according to biologist Jonathan Wells, are finches found on the Galapagos Islands off of South America, islands Darwin visited in 1835 on the voyage of the HMS Beagle.
Another icon of evolution are some species of birds on the Galapagos Islands that are very similar except for the size and shape of their beaks. And it's thought, and it's quite possible, that they evolved from a common ancestor because of having to eat different foods on the different islands.
In 1994, journalist Jonathan Weiner published The Beak of the Finch, a book about research into the Galapagos finches. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Weiner argued that the finches represent the best and most detailed demonstration to date of the power of Darwin's process. Similar claims are made in many biology textbooks.
The Galapagos finches are a spectacular example of evolution. When the food quality, in other words, the kind of food that was available, changed as a result of a drought or a particularly rainy year or something like that, over the course of just a couple of years, they could see dramatic changes in the beak sizes in various populations. Natural selection can drive changes of a structure, like the beak, in one direction in response to selective pressure, not just fast enough to account for what would be required for Darwin's theories, but actually 50 to 100 times faster than that.
A severe drought could cause many of the finches to die and leave only those with larger beaks. So in the following generation, the average beak size was increased. And some textbooks extrapolate this over 200 years or so and say that a few of these events strung together could transform these finches into a new species by making their beaks larger.
Look, the stuff about finch beaks is certainly interesting. Let's not confuse ourselves about that. The question is, can it be extrapolated, or does it represent cyclic variation?
What the books fail to mention is that as soon as the rains came back, the average beak size returned to normal. There was no net evolution. What we're really seeing is just one species oscillating back and forth with no real evolutionary change. So the evidence is exaggerated to make it appear to support Darwin's theory in a way that it really doesn't.
The contrary may be true. We may be seeing the development of entirely new species. The Galapagos finch starts off as a finch, and within 100 million years there'll be a Galapagos elephant. Could be. But we need a whole lot more by way of evidence than a couple of nutty journalists going down there looking at finch beaks and writing a Pulitzer Prize winning book. A whole lot more if this is to be serious science. I mean, this doesn't even pass the threshold of anecdote. Finch beaks change in size. Yeah, they do. They change in shape too. It seems to be correlated with seasons. There seems to be a regress back toward the mean when the seasons change again. If this is the part of a spectacular evolutionary extrapolation, let's have additional reasons for thinking that.
The changes are temporary, they oscillate back and forth, and they don't go anywhere. So, as evidence for the origin of species, Darwin's finches really don't work.
Well, we're running out of evidence here. We've looked at molecular biology. We've looked at the fossil record. We've taken a look at, as it was said, one of the best evidences for Darwin's theory, the finch's beak, and we seem to be coming up a little short. Lovetrap says, I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. When this happens, many people will pose the question, how did this ever happen? Indeed, how did this happen? How is it that for so long we have been led to believe in a theory that the evidence doesn't seem to support? Why is it that we live in a day and a time when any statement that is made against Darwinian theory is met with some of the most derisive comments? Because we're not dealing just simply with a scientific truth claim here. We have begun to deal with a philosophical truth claim that continues to point to scientific reasons for why it is true. And yet the problem is that evidence doesn't support it. Let's not make light of the issue, though, because you and I would hang on to our presupposition as strongly as those hang on to their presupposition. And whenever someone raises the mirror and the evidence begins to show that this is not just a little theory we're talking about, we're talking about a fundamental worldview that is based upon some notion that the scientific evidence allows me to leave God out of my worldview equation. And that is the battle that we see raging around us today. It's the battle that professors in universities face when they want to get an article published that is critical of Darwinian theory. It's the same thing that students face in the classroom if they question Darwinian theory. They are belittled in some cases, made to feel foolish in others. Why? Because this is a worldview in which people will desperately hang on to, because the consequences, as Wald said, I know that spontaneous generation has no evidence. I know that it is absolutely impossible, yet here I am. I believe in it. Why? Because the consequences of rejecting it turn them face to face with the reality of a creator. And they will not go there. So, Sagan says evolution is a fact, amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. That is just not true. Dawkins, remember, went even further to say it is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. I want you to understand that there is something deeper here than just the notion of a scientific theory. It is much deeper than that. Bozarth gives us an insight to that. He says evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. Destroy Adam and Eve and original sin, and in the rubble you will find the sorry remains of the Son of God. And if Jesus was not the Redeemer who dies for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. There is something at stake here that is deeper than a simple scientific theory. Man has a tendency, as the Scripture says, even though it is plain to him, what we have been looking at is simply examining what the box really says. Listen to it. It is plain to us. But man will exchange that truth of God for a lie, Romans says, in order that he may be free now to follow his inner desires. Ideas have deep consequences. All this stuff that we're talking about, all this worldview stuff, and all these things that we're building down here. In 2 tours from now, we are going to take a look at how all that gets worked out. And when you begin to lay a foundation down here that rejects the Creator and your accountability to Him and who He is, it can get ugly. That is this cosmic battle, the one that rages all around us. Battle between truth and lie. And it rages here in this area of science. And God has called us to to be a people who can see and clearly hear the glory of God and the work of his hands, and to not hide that, light under a bushel, but proclaim it, but to do it in a way that is winsome. Father, we acknowledge before you, we think about the incredible system you've given us that keeps us from bleeding to death. The eye itself, what a remarkable thing that you have given. The brain, our hands, a flower, a tree, the stars, the tail of a peacock. Oh, Father, it is beyond wonder. It is amazing. And Father, we confess that we have turned away from that. We have a tendency to walk in the midst of all those jewels and not acknowledge them. We do that now. Thank you for the glory that shines forth from your creation. Father, may it transform us as we gaze upon you in your creation. May we be the light and the salt that this world desperately needs. In Jesus' name, amen.